Somewhere in the middle of Texas, there was a large, foreign military base. Say Chinese or Russian. Imagine that thousands of armed foreign troops were constantly patrolling American streets in military vehicles. Imagine they were here under the auspices of keeping us safe, or promoting democracy, or protecting their strategic interests. Imagine that they operated outside of U.S. law and that the Constitution did not apply to them. Imagine that every now and then they made mistakes or acted on bad information and accidentally killed or terrorized innocent Americans, including women and children, most of the time with little or no repercussions or consequences. Imagine that they set up checkpoints on our soil and routinely searched and ransacked entire neighborhoods of homes. Imagine if Americans were fearful of these foreign troops and overwhelmingly thought America would be better off without their presence. Imagine if some Americans were so angry about them being in Texas that they actually joined together to fight them off in defense of our soil and sovereignty because leadership in government refused or were unable to do so. Imagine that those Americans were labeled terrorists or insurgents for their defensive actions and routinely killed or captured or tortured by the foreign troops on our land. Imagine that the occupiers' attitude was that if they just killed enough Americans, the resistance would stop. But instead, for every American killed, 10 more would take up arms against them, resulting in perpetual bloodshed. Imagine if most of the citizens of the foreign land also wanted these troops to return home. Imagine if they elected a leader who promised to bring them home and put an end to this horror. Imagine if that leader changed his mind once he took office. The reality is that our military presence on foreign soil is as offensive to the people that live there as armed Chinese troops would be if they were stationed in Texas. Shutting down military bases and ceasing to deal with other nations with threats and violence is not isolationism. It is the opposite. Opening ourselves up to friendship, honest trade, and diplomacy is the foreign policy of peace and prosperity. It is the only foreign policy that will not bankrupt us in the short order, as our current actions most definitely will. I share the disappointment of the American people in the foreign policy rhetoric coming from the administration.
There are 535 people on Capitol Hill whose job it is to write the laws that govern all of us, and he is one of them. There are 535 people on Capitol Hill whose job it is to preserve the Constitution, and he is one of them. There are 535 people whose job it is to preserve our liberties, and he is one of them. But in his heart and in his head, in his character and in his intellect, in what he has done and in what he will become, the Thomas Jefferson of our day, Ron Paul, is one of us.
I say this with amazement, but it's becoming more and more clear that we live in the age of Ron Paul, Judge. I mean, you stop and think about it. Who's the father of the Tea Party? It's Ron Paul. Not only is he the father of the Tea Party that won the majority of the House for Republicans in the 2010 midterm, but he's the father of so much of the discussion about the budget, about the debt ceiling, about taxes right now. This is the age of Ron Paul.
Where are the real conservatives? Where are the people that say all of this stuff that the Fed is doing is socialism? There was one, Ron Paul, but they drummed him out of the Republican Party.
I agree now with Ron Paul more than I did in 2008, and we have a choice, and I think this is the choice that's going to happen to us. You can't live in this middle ground with our Constitution. You can't. You either embrace the Constitution or shed the Constitution. And Ron Paul is the closest to our founders out of anyone up there.
When the people fear the government, that is tyranny. But when the government fears the people, that's liberty.
That is liberty. And liberty will reign in America.
Dr. Paul, who are you considering to be your vice presidential running mate?
The name Judge Napolitano jumps right.
In 2012, there was only one presidential candidate who predicted the economic collapse, who has never voted to raise your taxes, and who will bring our troops home. He has been right for decades.
This is not the kind of government that was designed by our founders of the country. It's not what was written in the Constitution. We've only had an income tax since 1913. But if you want a welfare state, and if you want to police the world and pay for the defense of Japan and Germany, send foreign aid to the Soviet Union, you not only need the income tax, you need the Federal Reserve to print up the money when the deficit is accumulated. So we think the government should be much smaller.
During the next decade, the American people will become poorer and less free, while they become more dependent on the government for economic security.
This country is in the middle of a recession for a lot of people. Michigan knows about it. Poor people know about it. The middle class knows about it. Wall Street doesn't know about it. Washington, D.C. doesn't know about it. But it's because of the monetary system and the excessive spending.
There's no joke. He is America's last true statesman, and he has actually been saying the same thing for the past 30 years about what our federal government needs to do to serve the people. That is, namely, follow the Constitution.
The Federal Reserve credit created during the last 8 months has not stimulated economic growth in technology or the industrial section. But a lot of it ended up in the expanding real estate bubble. This too will burst, as all bubbles do.
How could it be that you knew this on the banking committee in 2003 and nobody else did until after the collapse?
It really says a lot that the politically aware people in the military, those that are paying attention and engaged in the political process, are supporting someone who advocates an immediate withdrawal.
Our campaign got more money from the troops than all the other candidates put together.
It's now common knowledge that federal government computers are routinely used to compare lists of 18-year-olds who get driver's licenses with those who have registered for the draft. Computer surveillance seems appropriate for 1994 and unfortunately the wave of the future. This is in spite of the fact that Social Security's and Health and Human Services computers are already being used to keep tabs on our 18 and 19-year-olds. A recent story revealed an imaginary person received a threat from the Defense Department if he did not immediately register for the draft. Two brothers 7 years ago signed a fictitious name on an ice cream parlor's list in order to get a free sundae. This list unbelievably found its way into the government's files and is now being used for monitoring our teenagers. Millions of tax dollars are spent on this type of computer surveillance, a disgusting procedure for a professed free society. The irony is that it's done by an administration that brags about its limited government philosophy. And the little condemnation we hear comes from those who would involve government in every jot and tittle of our economic lives. Why is it that it's so difficult to defend freedom consistently across the board?
We're in the midst of a currency crisis. Our dollar is going down rapidly as we speak. It's because we have lived beyond our means. We can't afford the foreign policy that we have. We have to cut back. We have to live within our means. We're defaulting every single day. That's what your prices are doing. Your prices go up, they're defaulting on your money. So we need to look at the Federal Reserve System. The dollar is going down. The cost of living is going up. Our dollar today is worth 4 cents compared to the dollar of 1913 when the Federal Reserve took charge of it. And if you don't deal with the dollar, there will be no retirement for anybody. We're going to have chaos. And that is why you have to cut spending. That's why we need a new foreign policy. We find this, all this military activity overseas, it's bankrupting this country. We have this huge deficit. We're spending nearly $1 trillion with maintaining our empire overseas. So if we want prosperity, we have to change our foreign policy. We have to live within our means.
That if we don't want to cut any of the medical benefits for children or the elderly, because we have drawn so many in and got them so dependent on the government, if you want to work a transition, you have to cut a lot of money. And that's why I argue the case that this money ought to be cut out of foreign welfare and foreign militarism and corporate welfare and the military-industrial complex.
And the standard of living is going down today, but it's going down and the middle class is hurting because of the monetary policy. When you destroy a currency, the middle class gets wiped out. Poor countries don't even have middle classes. We used to have one, and they're on the ropes right now, but it has to do with a fiscal policy, monetary policy, and foreign policy of way too much spending. But it took a lot of years for us to get here. The people in this country have been begging for a change in direction, and they haven't had it. It's time we gave it to them.
All great nations come down because they extend themselves too far, the empire gets too big, and they can't afford it. Just as the Soviet system came down, that is what's happening. We better wake up and realize it, and realize that if we live within our means and with our Constitution, we're going to be safer and more prosperous.
We're broke, and we got to do something about it.
The role of government ought to be for the protection of liberty, not for the intrusion in our private lives, not for the intrusion in economic affairs.
You can't keep borrowing from China. You can't keep printing the money. We have to cut some spending.
I believe in limited government. I believe in individual liberty. We've spent too much. We tax too much. We borrow too much.
It's bankrupting this country.
This country is in a revolution. They're sick and tired of what they're getting, and I happen to be lucky enough to be part of it.
Don't get involved in these wars. Just bring our troops home.
There is absolutely never a reason to give up 1 ounce of freedom for the sake of security. It won't work. There is no authority in the Constitution authorizing a central bank, which means there should be no Federal Reserve system. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
I'm from College Station, Texas.
Buffalo, New York.
Bloomington, Indiana.
South Carolina.
Whether it's black, white, Asian, Puerto Rican, Mexican.
I'm from Spain. From Seattle, Washington.
From Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I'm here in Korea.
And I'm from Houston, Texas.
It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican.
Whether you're white, black, Asian, Mexican, rich, poor, Democratic, liberal, conservative, Republican, people are fed up, and it's time for a change. Ron Paul is the perfect person to lead that change.
Because he's a man of principle.
And he always sticks to policy.
And that he has never voted to raise his own congressional income. The man has integrity, and he'll
bring the actual change that we can believe in.
His idea is so powerful and motivating.
Ron Paul has a message of freedom.
A lot of people are saying, well, you know, he's not electable, or he's too old, or his ideas are too radical. If that's how people want to think, then you're denying yourselves an opportunity to experience liberty in your lifetime.